Just over 100 years ago, the so-called Great War killed an estimated 16 million people. It was a fully industrialized, mechanized global war. But why did so many die? Was it the trenches and mustard gas? The deadly machine guns? The aircraft? Or the first tanks? No. The machine that enabled death on such a horrendous scale was, in fact, the train. In this programme, I'm exploring and travelling on the railways of the Western Front. This locomotive, the first thing you notice is it's incredibly small. It's like something out of a children's story. The railways that promised a quick, decisive war. The trains that delivered millions to be slaughtered on the front lines. All the ammunition, the shells, the bullets, the guns, all the supplies were brought up here. And the long-lost lines that tried to break the deadlock. And actually, you can see the marks of where all the sleepers would have been laid. I'll hear the words and even the voices of the people who travelled on them.
We had set out in a drunken atmosphere of blood.
We had to face a very heavy machine gun fire. At last, all was ready for going over the top.
And I'll discover why the First World War was truly the Railway War. It's a little-known fact that the First World War began at a small railway station in Luxembourg. But it didn't go exactly to plan. We're coming to a place called Trois Vierges, the Three Virgins, where on the 1st of August 1914, the Germans launched a surprise attack. It's very quiet. It's a nice sort of place. It's really not the sort of place where you'd expect World War I to start. Trois Vierges station has changed little since that fateful summer's evening in 1914, when at 6 p.m. the local police chief, who was off duty relaxing at home, heard a bit of a racket outside. He went outside and saw armed vehicles pouring down this street in great clouds of dust, making their way down there, where he saw what were unmistakably soldiers jumping out of the truck and running into the railway station. He was strangely unconcerned. In his statement later, he said he considered giving the police station a ring. Little did he know that his country was being invaded, and the Germans' first objective was this railway station. The German commanding officer, Lieutenant Feldman, came in here looking menacing, brandishing a gun. Legend has it that a local band started to play a national song at the soldiers in protest. And then something even more bizarre happened. Another military vehicle arrived carrying two men with a message saying, "Don't invade Luxembourg today, go back to Germany." So Feldman put down his gun, apologized profusely, and went home. It turns out that he got the first message from the Kaiser saying, "Invade Luxembourg today." But he hadn't got the second one saying, "Had second thoughts, invasion cancelled." You couldn't make it up. Just 12 hours later, the Kaiser changed his mind again. So the German army dutifully recaptured Trois Vierges station along with the rest of Luxembourg, and the war really had begun. However farcical the accidental invasion of Trois Vierges railway station may seem, it does demonstrate two things about the coming war. One is the importance of the railways, and two, that the most carefully laid plans will almost certainly fail. In the run-up to World War I, railways in Europe had reached their peak. Thousands of miles of track crisscrossed the entire continent. Trains had reached speeds of over 100 miles an hour, and Germany in particular saw the potential of the train to achieve a quick, decisive victory in the war that, well, everyone knew was coming. 1914 saw the culmination of an arms race at a time of great technological advancement. There were two main alliances, the British with the Russians and the French, and on the other side the Germans with the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans. And the war that happened was only possible because of the railways. This is what Europe looked like in August 1914. I'm going to be travelling across France, Britain, Belgium and Germany to explore the railways of the war. First, I'm heading to the border between Germany and Belgium, where the Germans had quietly been preparing on a massive scale. This morning, railway historian Achim Conny Jung is taking me to the remains of a station built in a small rural town near the border. He's driving me onto what's left of the platform. Some of these platforms were nearly a mile long. Whoa, look at this place. It's completely run down. At one point, it must have been a really significant place.
Yeah, it was, until 1909, this place was a little station. Then the Germans started to improve existing lines, double track them. Where it was too steep, it was flattened. No more gradient than a 1%.
This was one of several launching points where a massive invasion force could be unloaded from trains. But did the locals have any idea what it was for? So suddenly they've got this great big modern railway line, double track, signal boxes, points. They must have thought something's going on.
The people say, well, it's incredible. I got a 1.2 kilometer station in front of my farm, you know, with 6 sidings. It's very nice.
Yeah.
These are good people because they're getting me now with my cow and my 4 milk cans very easy to the next fair. And he doesn't think over it.
They didn't suss that there was part of a build-up to war at all.
No.
How busy was this place?
Well, it was incredibly busy. In the first weeks of war, the German railways transported 3.2 million soldiers, plus 860,000 horses. Then you have guns.
Yeah.
And they had a timetable. That timetable went like a clockwork. Incredible.
Using these railway stations, the Kaiser had a plan to win the war against not Belgium, but France, in just 40 days. In August 1914, the Railway War began. Years of preparation were about to be put to the test. The Kaiser knew that France in the west and Russia in the east were allies, and to win the war he'd have to defeat them both. But the Germans didn't have the manpower to fight on 2 fronts, so they hatched a master plan to use the railways that they hoped would win them the war. The original plan was drawn up in 1905 by Field Marshal Alfred von Schlieffen. His idea involved mobilizing nearly all of Germany's troops to overpower France in just 40 days. The key was to avoid the heavily fortified French border in Alsace, instead relying on Belgium and Luxembourg to let the Germans use their railways to power through to northern France. Paris would quickly fall, and then the troops could turn east to take on Russia. On August the 2nd, the plan began for real. German troops invaded defenseless Luxembourg, and the Belgians were given an ultimatum: let us through or else. But Albert, the Belgian king, was having none of it. He famously told the Kaiser that Belgium was a country, not a road. So the Germans had to fight their way in. I'm now following their route through Belgium to Liège, a strategically important city due to its rail connections into France, where their journey hit a major snag. The Schlieffen plan was flawed. It was inflexible, running unachievable timetables, and they completely underestimated the Belgian king and his army. The German invasion stalled here, one of 12 forts built to defend Liège. You have to remember the appalling odds the men defending this fort faced. There were only 500 of them facing the might of the Germans, and yet they suppressed wave after wave of attack. The story of the gunners defending this fort has entered Belgian folklore. It was August and this room was stiflingly hot. The air was full of dust and gas from all the shelling. The men were desperate for some fresh air, and the captain asked the commanding officer if they could go outside for a while, and he said, no. You must remain where you are. The Germans are outside at our walls. Everybody must stay at their posts. For 10 days, the outnumbered Belgians, led by General Gerard Leman, held fast. The Germans were forced to call in their secret weapon, a newly built Big Bertha field gun. At nearly 50 tons, it had to be transported from the factory in Germany by train. But when they reached the border, they hit a problem. The Belgians had sabotaged their own railway lines. So Big Bertha had to be taken off the trains, dismantled, and then pushed by road all the way from the Belgian border to Liège. Across Belgium, saboteurs were destroying the one bit of technology that was crucial to Germany achieving her goals of a swift victory, their own railways. It took 6 days to get Big Bertha into range, where it fired a salvo of 7 800-kilogram high-explosive shells at the fort. Just look at the size of this crater, and this was made by a shell that didn't explode against the old wall of the fort, but with an impact energy of 3,600 tons, it certainly made its mark. This hole was originally 24 feet deep. One of the shells exploded here in the fort's gunpowder store. It was holding 12 tons of gunpowder. General Leman wrote,
I was thrown violently to the ground. I managed to rise and continue my way, only to be stopped by a choking cloud of poisonous gas. I saw to my horror that the fort had fallen, slopes and counter-slopes being a chaos of rubbish, while huge tongues of flame were shooting forth from the throat of the fortress.
Leman was captured by the Germans, but 250 of his comrades remained buried under the rubble. The gunners who refused to break loyally stayed at their posts, suffocating as the air ran out. A terrible way to die, but at least it wasn't in vain. The defense of Liège and the sabotage of the railways dealt a huge blow to the Germans. The Schlieffen plan had been delayed, and it gave the British and French armies time to mobilise. On the day Germany invaded Belgium, Britain declared war, but they faced an almighty challenge. Over 100,000 armed men needed to be transported across Britain into France fast. I've come to the northeast of England to check out the Richborough, a magnificent 42-ton locomotive built for the war effort. Like the Germans, the British realised that the railways would play a very important part in the coming war, but we were nothing like just prepared. For starters, there were over 100 privately owned companies that all had to be brought into line. Local author Roger Jeremy has tagged along to tell me more. So was this all controlled by the government, by the War Office?
Yes, the government set up a railway executive with the idea of trying to coordinate a railway system which consisted of many, many different railway companies. It meant that the government could cause companies to cease running things like excursion trains. They were freeing up paths by trains being cancelled, so that there were then paths for the military traffic, etc. The government really had complete control over the railways at that time.
This lovely old locomotive that pulling us now, is that part of World War I?
Yes, it was. It was built in 1917, but it was actually moved down to the port of Richborough in Kent. And Richborough was the first port in England to have a sort of roll-on, roll-off service so that railway wagons carrying ammunition could be rolled directly onto the ferry.
At the end of the first month of the war, the railways had transported 118,000 soldiers, 37,000 horses, 5,000 vehicles and 314 heavy guns. Mobilisation was a triumph, but there was one major problem. With only 700,000 men to call upon, the British Army was too small to fight a land war against nearly 4 million German soldiers. New recruits were needed and fast. Thanks to the railways, men could be recruited and trained all over Britain and the colonies. One major training centre would be created right here in the town of Alnwick. The popular perception was that the war would be over by Christmas, but the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, disagreed. He said it could take as long as 3 years, so he led an enlistment campaign to get groups of friends to all join up together, and they got the nickname the Pals Battalions. Alnwick's response to Kitchener's war cry was overwhelming. The local newspaper reported in September 1914 that 120 recruits marched up this street and were played to the railway station by a section of the drum and fife band. The station, which has since been converted into a bookshop, was at the heart of Alnwick's war effort, sending volunteers to the front and bringing the wounded home. But the station soon had another role, supporting a brand new training camp here. This magnificent castle is the ancestral home of the Dukes of Northumberland. In 1914, the Duke allowed these pastures to be used as a training camp for 4,000 young volunteers. They turned out to be among the most unfortunate volunteers in the whole of World War I. 94-year-old Cliff Pettit has lived in Alnwick all his life, and he's an authority on the brigades that trained here.
Chris, this is the area of the famous Alnwick camp.
Yeah.
And you can see the Alnwick Castle, the Duke of Northumberland's residence.
Yeah.
And that river is the River Aln.
Mm. And then where were their living quarters? Where did they sleep?
The living quarters were on your left, beyond those trees.
Yeah.
And the trees are still the same trees.
The soldiers came from Tyneside, 30 miles away, where men from Scottish and Irish communities, mostly coal miners, volunteered in huge numbers for Kitchener's army. So with the Irish and the Scottish and the Tynesiders, was there a sort of Celtic link? Did they wear kilts?
No, they all thought they were going to wear kilts.
Well, why not?
They wanted to be affiliated to the Scottish regiment, so it's too far away. And the War Office said, no, you're not going to have kilts.
What was the atmosphere like in the camp? Did they not have a sense of fear, really, about what they might be going
through? They were
through?
enthusiastic.
Were they?
Oh, they were. You can imagine spending all your life in a pit to suddenly see the possibility of walking in a kilt down the middle of Paris with all the mademoiselles eyeing them up. Must have been an absolute bonanza for some of them.
A war veteran called Brigadier General Trevor Ternan came out of retirement to lead the Tyneside Scottish. He admitted having trouble understanding their Geordie accents, but was in no doubt of the quality of his men.
It was soon evident that here was, in my hands, all the material for a magnificent brigade. The physique of the men, after the necessary weeding out of the crocks had been attended to, left nothing to be desired. And I quickly came to the conclusion that, though the bulk of the officers had had little or no previous military experience, the keenness to learn and intelligence would soon rectify that matter.
After 8 months of training, on the 1st of August 1915, Brigadier General Ternan and the Tyneside Scottish felt it was time to leave Alnwick. The regimental records show that it took 10 trains to take them all south. As they headed for war, their morale was bolstered by a promise given the previous evening at a regimental dinner, a promise that appealed to their Celtic origins. While delivering a toast, one of the colonels said that a promise had been made to the Tyneside Scottish that if they distinguished themselves when they come back, they would have the privilege of wearing the kilt. The trains first took the men to Salisbury Plain for further training. Then, 4 months later, they boarded more trains for Folkestone for the crossing to France. Every day, ships crossed the Channel to Calais, Dieppe, Boulogne, Le Havre and St. Valery. Soldiers, munitions and supplies were disembarked in France in vast numbers. The railways had facilitated a war unlike any that had come before, and these men now faced horrors they could never have imagined. The seaside town of St. Valery in northern France was the start of just one of many railways that was feeding a new type of war. Starting on the quayside of the small port, thousands of troops and tons of supplies were carried by this railway to the Western Front. Before the war, this line was used by the well-to-do of French society who came to St. Valery for the new fad of sea bathing. But for 4 years, it became a very important war railway. Like Britain, the French government had taken control of the railways. And even this cheerful day trippers train wasn't spared from playing its part. It must have been a really dramatic change when this nice family railway suddenly became a carrier of weapons of war. And over the 4 years, from 1914 to 1918, this would have completely changed its identity. This locomotive was built in Paris in 1906, so it would almost certainly have been used for the war effort. This train's back to providing what it always did, a day out for mums, dads and really noisy kids. This morning I'm taking the same 5-mile journey the trains packed with men and ammunition once took to the edge of the war zone. Many of the soldiers would have been experiencing a foreign land for the first time. In the winter of 1915, a Suffolk schoolteacher who volunteered to join the East Surrey Regiment travelled on a journey like this, but with a sense of dread. Before leaving for France, Charles Alcott wrote a letter to his wife, fearing that he may well never see her again.
Darling, sweetheart wife, so this is the end of all our dreams. For me, a soldier's grave in a foreign land, and for you, a lonely widowhood. My last thoughts will be of you. God bless you and the baby, and father and mother. Your always loving husband, Charlie.
The letter was only to be opened by Mary, his wife, in the event of his death. He was right to fear the worst. He was travelling to hell. Right, this is my stop, a place called Noyelles-sur-Mer. In this place would have been a hive of activity, constant wagons coming in, unloading ammunition and men, and then putting them onto other trains, and all going that way to the front. For the next leg of my journey, I've hopped about 200 miles east to the Champagne region near the Belgian border. I'm now following the route of a German unit that would end up on the same battlefield as Charles Alcott. One young 19-year-old German soldier who arrived in France was called Ernst Junger. He was positively thrilled about the prospect of going to war. He was looking forward to it. He ran away from school to join the Foreign Legion, and then as soon as war broke out, he enlisted in the German army and went to France. He wrote a very uncompromising memoir about life in the trenches, and the whole thing started for him the first day he set foot on French soil.
The train stopped at Bazencourt, a small town in Champagne, and we got out. Full of awe and incredulity, we listened to the slow, grinding pulse of the front. We were enraptured by war. We had set out in a rain of flowers, in a drunken atmosphere of blood and roses. Surely the war had to supply us with what we wanted. The great, the overwhelming, the hallowed experience.
Junger's war began and ended on a train. During 4 long years at the front, he endured a very different type of warfare, which needed a very different type of railway. By 1915, the Allies had stalled the German advance. Both sides dug in, and a staggering 35,000 miles of trenches made up the Western Front. A deadly killing ground, made possible by the railways, which fed both sides with a continuous supply of machines, ammunition, and young men ready to die. This is an actual World War I trench. Water everywhere, mud, rats, trench foot, probably having to sleep in conditions like this, keeping low all the time for fear of snipers. This is a real haunting look at what it would have been like for guys who lived in conditions like this for months on end, and always the smell of death. By early 1916, the Tyneside Scottish were camped in trenches like these. In his memoir, their commanding officer, Brigadier General Trevor Turner, reported some very bold rodents.
In one case, an officer, on awakening, found that every one of the bone buttons on his clothes had been chewed off by rats while he rested for a few hours in the night. Many rats were killed, but still they increased.
Of course, a far worse fate involved climbing out of the trench and facing the enemy. Walking out into no man's land gives me a sense of the horror of this war. Hundreds of thousands died out here. The amount of weaponry and ammunition that was expended beggars belief. And the problem was, for every man that died, every bullet fired and shell that exploded, more could be delivered by train the very next day, creating an endless, catastrophic stalemate. But to do this, the railways had to evolve. A regiment of 12,000 men would need 1,000 tons of supplies every day. So that would be a requirement for 2 trains and, say, 50 wagons. But for the railway itself, you'd be covering ground which was deeply pitted with bombs, all sorts of strange craters, thick, deep mud. Oh, and also you'd be under constant fire. So what you need is a little locomotive like this and tracks like this. The Petit Train de la Haute-Somme is the last remaining example of more than 1,200 miles of railway that shuttled to and from the trenches, keeping the Allied war machine going. This locomotive was built specifically for the Somme offensive. It's amazing, it's over 100 years old, and think how tough it must have been for it, yet it looks great and still works really well. Hello, messieurs. Oh, is it okay here? It's chilling to wonder how many men were pulled by this loco to their deaths, and how much ammunition it carried, killing thousands of young Germans on the other side. first thing you notice is it's incredibly small. It's like something out of a children's story. This is about a quarter the size of a normal freight locomotive. But this locomotive and other ones like it during the war could pull 1,500 tons of ammunition and deliver it up to the front every single day of the Somme offensive. The cleverest thing about this railway is the track. Divided into steel segments, it could be clicked together like a toy railway. Soldiers with no skill as railwaymen could click together up to 5 miles of track over muddy, bumpy land in a single day. At the beginning of the war, the Germans wanted to keep all their railway lines nice and flat, no steep inclines. But with these narrow gauge railways, basically they had no problem at all with steep gradients. Hills were dead easy. Look at this one, powering up this hill. We're stopping at an important clearing in the forest. During the war, this area was used by the Allies to unload heavily laden trains every few hours. The front line is just up there. The trenches would have been up there. So trains like this are constantly coming in and out, unloading here. All the ammunition, the shells, the bullets, the guns, all the supplies were brought up here. By spring 1916, an Allied plan was underway, using the trench railways to try and break the deadlock. And the area where they decided to mount their surprise attack was the Somme. That town down there is called La Boisselle. It's very much a German stronghold, certainly by 1916, and a big target for the British. And the Tommies who mapped out the areas always like to call places by very British-sounding names. So that valley over there was called Sausage Valley. So, of course, that one there had to be called Mash Valley. All this area here with these beautiful flowers, this is all what was no man's land. And the plan to take the town involved the Royal Engineers digging a 1,000-foot tunnel from the British lines all the way under here to come up just in front of the German lines, the German trenches where those trees are, just over there. Under a veil of secrecy, a huge consignment of explosives brought in by the trench railway was packed into this tunnel. The plan was to detonate the explosives, smash the German defences to bits, get up out the trenches, stroll across no man's land and take the town in about 20 minutes. For 7 days before detonation, the Allies bombarded the German lines. Meanwhile, Allied troops waited for the order to go over the top, a time known as 0 hour. Among them was Brigadier General Tarrant, who was preparing his Tyneside Scottish for their first taste of battle.
All ranks were full of confidence. The artillery bombardment had been so severe that it was thought by many that the enemy would be too much demoralized to make much stand. The ladders and the bridges were in position. Arrangements had been made for supplying the men with a good breakfast early the following morning. And at last, after weeks of arduous work, all was ready for going over the top.
In June 1916, the Western Front stretched 440 miles from the English Channel to Switzerland. By Friday, the 30th of June, after 6 days of heavy bombardment in the Somme, 100,000 Allied soldiers were in position to break through an 11.5-mile stretch of the line. Brigadier General Tarrant's Tyneside Scottish were poised outside La Boisselle, and less than a mile away, in the German trenches, infantryman Ernst Junger sheltered from the British bombardment.
From early morning on, our trench was subjected to mortar attack at shorter and shorter intervals. By noon, I'd had enough. With a few other fellows, I aimed at our opponent's trenches. A pretty feeble reply, admittedly, to the heavy bombs we were being plowed with.
Further south, the Germans were defending a village called Montauban, which had a railway station hidden in a small area called Bertha Wood. Just 800 yards from the station was the British front line, where down in the trenches, Suffolk schoolteacher Charles Alcock was preparing for the big push towards Montauban. Alcock led a small band of soldiers. Shortly before leading them over the top, he wrote to his wife's parents.
I shall be going over with my boys. It's an honor, Mother and Father, and if I go under, you know that it will be whilst leading my lads. What a lot I shall be able to tell you afterwards. P.S. Don't show this to Mary, or she will worry so much.
According to this original trench map, I'm standing now pretty much exactly where Charles Alcock would have been. But the view, looking on this map, is pretty much the same. The town you can see over there, that's Montauban. That's there on this map. And then over there to the right, that's Bertha Wood. Now, that's where the railway station would have been. That's there. It's very difficult to imagine in this beautiful French setting, this lovely flat ploughed field, but in 1916, this would have been hell. Charles Alcock and his men faced a fight through hundreds of yards of no man's land. 3 German trenches, snipers, barbed wire and mines. To achieve this, they needed inspired leadership. It came in the form of one of Alcock's fellow officers, a maverick called Captain Wilfred Neville. Neville was great. He used to do things for morale of the men, like he'd give them footballs with things like the Great European Cup Final, C Company versus the Huns written on them. And on the back there'd be things like no referee, which meant basically in this battle coming up, there are no rules, anything goes. And the object of the game would be to dribble through no man's land and then score a goal right in the German trench. Yeah! I'm curious to find out more about the little railway station caught up in the Battle of the Somme. And it turns out Montauban station is now a bed and breakfast. So I might even stay the night. Christophe.
We are very pleased to
Over the years, Christine and Jean-Pierre Matt have amassed an amazing collection.
Welcome to the station.
The station grounds are packed with shells, shrapnel, railway track and debris, stark relics of the bombardment and the battle that follows. Jean-Pierre, I know this is only a tiny bit of your vast collection. There's all sorts of guns and rifles and even swords here, but see, I like this. Is this the original water?
Ceci est une gourde anglaise que j'ai trouvée il y a quelques années. Effectivement, il y a quelque chose dedans. Je ne sais pas ce que c'est parce que je n'ai jamais voulu enlever le bouchon. Alors, est-ce que c'est de l'eau, du rhum ou du whisky? Je ne pense pas que ce soit du whisky, car le whisky était réservé aux officiers.
This one here, it's just a boot. What's so special?
Dans cette chaussure britannique, effectivement, j'ai retrouvé les os qui correspondaient aux orteils. Mais je n'ai trouvé que la paire de chaussures, je n'ai pas trouvé de corps. Alors la seule chose que j'avais à faire, c'était de faire un petit trou en mémoire de ce soldat et de mettre les os dans ce petit trou.
I've been given the station master's bedroom for the night. It's quite unnerving staying in this place overnight. On the 30th of June 1916, this station had a really heavy bombardment as they prepared for 0 hour. So tomorrow morning I want to get up and find out what exactly happened to this railway station and also why the Battle of the Somme went down in history. On the morning of the 1st of July 1916, Montauban railway station was in German hands. It had been under a heavy British bombardment for 7 days until at 7:28 a.m. an earth-shattering noise was heard in the distance. The explosion was so loud it was heard here 6 miles away at Montauban station. Some said it was heard as far away as the centre of London. It was caused by the 60,000 pounds of explosives that the railway had brought to the Somme. A charge was sent down a tunnel under no man's land to just in front of the German trenches. The enormous crater it left remains a powerful reminder of the sheer scale of this horrific war. Standing at the bottom of this crater gives you some idea of the awesome power of the explosion. One Tyneside Scot, who was a few hundred yards away in the British line, said, "The earth was just quaking all around us and there was debris falling on us out of the sky." 2 minutes after the blast, the whistles blew and the soldiers climbed out of their trenches. They now faced 200 yards of no man's land before reaching the crater and the German lines. The British would have come up over the top from more or less the green you can see, and then slowly marched up this hill, just hoping that the massive explosion had done its job. But to the horror of the British troops, the Germans had built their trenches deep with concrete reinforcements. They re-emerged to man their machine gun posts. Brigadier General Turnan's pride and confidence in his Tyneside Scottish Brigade rapidly dissolved into despair.
Officers and men had been literally mowed down. But in rapidly diminishing numbers, they had resolutely pushed on to meet their deaths close to the enemy's wire. No man's land was reported to be heaped with dead.
The Tyneside Scots suffered some of the very worst casualties. At the end of one single day, 2,500 of them were either killed, missing, or badly injured. To give you an idea of the scale of loss, if you go to the left of the White Horse, it's only that proportion that survived unscathed. All the rest were lost. Meanwhile, 6 miles south, another even more unlikely plan to break the deadlock sprang into operation, with Charles Alcock and Captain Neville kicking their footballs into no man's land. What actually happened became the stuff of legend in the newspapers of the day. There are all sorts of fanciful accounts, but probably the most reliable one is in a letter from Charles Alcock to Captain Wilfred Neville's sister after the battle.
"5 minutes before 0 time, your brother strolled up in his usual calm way, and we shared a last joke before going over. The company went over the top very well, with Soames and your brother kicking off with the company footballs. We had to face a very heavy rifle and machine gun fire. And nearing the front German trench, the lines slackened pace slightly. Seeing this, Wilfred dashed in front with a bomb in his hand. And was immediately shot through the head.
Neville was one of almost 20,000 British soldiers who died on the 1st of July. He's buried a few hundred yards behind the lines where he was killed. The story of Captain Neville's football and the charge that followed was told and retold back home at his barracks as a way of inspiring other young soldiers. Because although he tragically died, it was actually a rare British success. They smashed through the German lines and they were in sight of Montauban railway station. By the end of the first day, they'd captured Montauban village. And 2 days later, the British prepared to advance the remaining 500 yards to Bernafay Wood to capture the railway station. So they'd have come across this field from Montauban into here, Bernafay Wood, not really knowing what to expect. All these trees would have been flattened, a lot of them cut off at the roots by artillery blasts, and they wouldn't have known how many Germans were still here guarding it. Now, they're trying to get to Montauban station there, but they would not have known how many Germans were around, and there would have been bullets whizzing past them, exploding shells, but they would have had very little cover. And of course, when the machine gun fire started up, suddenly it became a very scary place indeed. And apparently these woods still hold a lot of unexploded shells, so you have to be pretty careful where you walk in these woods even to this day. It's a pretty scary place. The British lost 6 men during the advance, and to their relief, the Germans surrendered when they reached the station. A small gain, but a heavy price had been paid. So many deaths led up to the taking of this station, but the futility of war is demonstrated by the fact that just a few months later, the Germans took the station back, and then the Allies, a few weeks after that, took the station back again. And as a footnote, schoolteacher Charles Alcock, it was reported to the regiment, had been hit in the head and killed. Reports of his death proved premature. Alcock may have been injured, but he survived and was reunited with his wife Mary after the war. She probably never read the letter he'd written to her in the event of his death. The Battle of the Somme ended in November 1916, with the British making only moderate advances, at a cost across both sides of 300,000 lives and 1 million casualties. First thing that strikes you in these war cemeteries is just how young. 18, 19, 1 or 2, 20. Such a waste. And then you get this thing where there are 2 on the one gravestone, which means basically they found 2 identity tags but could not work out which bones went with which arm went. It's awful. It's shocking. And the other one you see a lot, it'll just say, a soldier of the Great War, known unto God. You can't actually imagine what it was like here. One estimate says they think there are 300,000 unknown soldiers' bodies still under the fields. Just think, what for? What for? What was the point? The attempt to break the deadlock had failed, and with so many dead and wounded, there was now an acute shortage of manpower, both on the front line and on the railways that kept them supplied. So the commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Field Marshal Haig, started another recruitment campaign, this time in China. Incredibly, 96,000 men answered Haig's call and set off on what was one of the most amazing sea and rail journeys of the whole war. They travelled 12,000 miles. It took 3 months to assist in another man's war. The Chinese made a vital but often forgotten contribution to the wartime railway. Journalist Wenlan Peng has been researching their stories. Wenlan, how did they get here?
Well, it was a very circuitous journey because they were called over in 1917. And by that time, you had U-boats patrolling the Mediterranean. Yeah. And so they decided in their great wisdom to transport them right across the Pacific by ship, overland across Canada by train. During that 8 to 10 day journey, they weren't allowed off the trains at all.
After being cooped up on these trains, the Chinese labourers crossed the Atlantic to Liverpool and travelled by train to France, where many were put to work on the railways. Why did they do it? Why?
Well, you have one particular province on the east coast of China called Shandong, and this was at the crux of the problem. China wanted Shandong back because at the time of the World War, it was under German control.
Were they not promised by the Allied forces that they would get Shandong if they helped?
Well, there was a certain agreement, let's put it that way, a certain understanding that obviously if China took part in the war, then there would be some kind of a reward at the end of the day during the peace negotiations. That's what you normally do.
Very few of the Chinese railway workers could read or write, but at least one educated worker could. Sun Gan kept a diary which describes the daily dangers they faced.
Around noon one day, someone suddenly called out there was a German plane overhead. As soon as it came into sight, I could see all the workers in the workshop to the west of depot running out far into the fields. Then it dropped a bomb. Luckily, the bomb landed in a deep muddy ditch just outside the workshop and didn't go off. At that point, everyone cheered thunderously at our lucky escape. Then everyone went back to the workshop to resume work.
Chinese normally are very industrious and very efficient, aren't they?
They worked very, very quickly, and very often they would be hauling the sleepers in such a fast manner that even Douglas Haig would say something like, "By Jove, if only we had a whole army of them, we'd certainly win the war."
For many of Sun Gan's fellow labourers, the luck didn't last. Few records were kept of their deaths, but it's thought that thousands died. The volunteers had only really come to Europe to get their home Shandong back from the Germans. But in the peace treaties that followed the war, the Allies gave away their homeland to their deadliest enemy, Japan. In late 1916, it was the Germans' turn to take the initiative. The new head of the armed forces, Paul von Hindenburg, came up with a radical new plan to win the war. He ordered his soldiers to retreat. In February 1917, the Germans left their trenches in the Somme and retreated east. They gave away 1,000 square miles of ground. But why? They too had suffered enormous manpower losses during the slaughter of the Somme, and they wanted to build shorter, more solid defensive lines. So they came up with the Hindenburg Line. The Western Front had been largely static for 2.5 years, until the Germans retreated some 20 miles east of the Somme. The new Hindenburg Line ran from Arras in the north to La Faux in the south. The new line was made of steel and concrete and was intended to be even more impregnable than the front line at the Somme. The Germans' tactical retreat was certainly a surprise for the Allies, but then the Allies came up with a new surprise of their own, and it meant a brand new role for the railway. And this railway would be even smaller than the ones used to take munitions to the Somme. To find out how it worked, I've arrived at the main square in Arras, which in 1917 was in Allied hands, a few hundred yards from the German Hindenburg Line. If you look closely at the bricks on most of these buildings, they've all got a sort of whitish colour. That white rock is chalk, which has been quarried for centuries directly under my feet. I'm going 20 metres below street level to see an extraordinary network of tunnels that were used by the Allies to launch a surprise attack on the enemy lines. There's a really powerful atmosphere down here. 24,000 men hid down here for 8 days and nights before one of the most audacious attacks of World War I in April 1917. This subterranean world was originally a set of unconnected quarries. Tunnels had to be dug to link them together, but this created a problem. What to do with the excess chalk? If it was brought to the surface, German reconnaissance planes might figure out that the Allies were digging. Everywhere the chalk had to be mined to clear the way through the tunnels. But of course they daren't take it up to the top because it would have been spotted. So it's put into little wagons on rails and just pushed all around the complex and dumped in these piles. This is great. This is what it would have been like. And you see men here going up the final tunnel and coming out terrifyingly over the top. You see a train coming in, and the trains actually were getting smaller and smaller and smaller. From some time in 1916, this whole tunnel here was used as a railway, and this type of wagon was used to move the chalk. And they literally would go off on rails, constantly clearing it, getting the chalk out of the way as they cut their way through. And actually, if you look along there, you can very clearly see the marks of where all the sleepers would have been laid. This tunnel's incredibly long and low. It's something like 200 meters. And this is a staircase that makes its way out and up to the top. And on the 9th of April, 1917, at 5:30 a.m., 20-odd thousand soldiers, all in single file, made their way up staircases like this, up to the top. At first, the attack worked. The Germans were pushed back nearly 7 miles, a huge gain. But the Germans had fortified the area even further behind their front line. The Allies were exposed and suffered huge casualties, as many as 4,000 a day. The tunnels and underground railways of Arras had failed to break the deadlock, and the stalemate resumed. My journey is taking me back to Belgium, behind the Hindenburg line, to see a feat of engineering that would help change the course of the Railway War again. In 1918, it was the Germans' turn to try to break the stalemate. They launched an offensive called Operation Michael, or the Kaiser's Battle. This is the colossal Monzon Viaduct, built during the war by the Germans to link Belgian ports with the industrial heartlands of the Ruhr. Even today, it carries 60 freight trains a day. This viaduct helped turn the war in Germany's favour. And historian Achim Connie-Young also sees it as a foretaste of what the Nazis would do in the next war. This is an amazing structure, isn't it? What's its history?
It was constructed by workers that were slave laborers, that were Russian prisoners of war during the war.
See, that sounds like the Nazis, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. But all this improvement of railway lines in the West, and also in France, and also the construction of the so-called Hindenburg line was done by slave laborers and prisoners of war. And it is claimed that some Russian workers that were killed during the war are still in the concrete pillars.
What was the eventual use for this viaduct?
It was constructed for supporting the Western Front, and in the Spring Offensive it played a major role.
In the 1918 Spring Offensives, the Germans powered back into France. Russia had pulled out of the war, freeing up around 40 German divisions who were sent west to finally crush the Allies. It was the Kaiser's last roll of the dice. From March 1918, revitalized German forces swept across the Western Front, deep into enemy territory. But they advanced too far and became cut off from their railway supply lines. The Allies struck back with tanks and huge railway guns. One casualty was our veteran of the Somme. It was during this counter-offensive that volunteer Ernst Junger's luck finally ran out. He was shot in the chest defending a captured village, and from there made his way onto a hospital train.
I was lying on the rumbling bed of a hospital train. The German landscape was already bathed in the luster of early autumn. I was fortunate enough to be taken off the train at Hanover and was put up in the Clementine Infirmary. Among the visitors who soon arrived, I was particularly glad to see my brother.
Ernst Junger's war hadn't ended in the hallowed experience he craved, but as one of the millions of men evacuated on ambulance trains. Many millions more left by train as prisoners of war. The final chapter of my journey on the railways of the Western Front concerns a little-known story involving some of those prisoners. A few of the 10 million who were captured during the war. Most of the British prisoners of war who were taken to any one of the 300 camps went by train. The prisoners were taken to railway stations like this one in northern Germany and marched to the camps. Even inside the camps, narrow-gauge railways, so common on the Western Front, were frequently used to distribute supplies to the POWs. And it was inside these camps that some of the prisoners' voices were preserved forever. I've come to Berlin to visit an archive that until comparatively recently was believed to have been lost forever. Professor Sebastian Klotz is the chief archivist. I'm fascinated by this place. So what are these? What's in these files?
Basically, shellac recordings made during the World War I from prisoners in German prisoners of war camps.
The recordings in these cabinets were made by a German linguist called Wilhelm Durgens, who used prisoners to further his scientific research, using a cumbersome device he'd invented that was capable of recording sound. Can I have a peep? I won't touch.
Please do. You must be so curious to see what the material looks like. Any of these drawers contain some 100 recordings, and each recording carries a recording of one individual.
What sort of things did they record? What was the content?
They picked the prodigal son, an episode from the Bible, and asked the prisoners, the inmates, to read them out aloud.
These precious discs are among the only voice recordings of the era from common men.
Here we are. This is one individual recording out of the several thousands that we have. We've identified it as an English speaker, prisoner of war at the time. Now, this is what the material looks like, and the call number leads us to the written documentation. These are the originals that we pulled from the shelf, giving the date and the prisoner camp in Güstrow in northern Germany.
So he's John Townend?
Absolutely. We have his home place.
Somewhere called Shelley?
Yeah.
Huddersfield?
Yeah.
And before the war, he was a steam engine driver?
And explicitly states Yorkshire English.
There was a man who had two sons. The young girl said to his father, "Give me that pen of yours, goods that belongs to me." So his father gave him his share.
Very Yorkshire, isn't it?
After, young man gathered all
Very
his boys
Yorkshire.
together and went away to their far country. I said, "Go back to me, father." He had this very day I'll start for home. I'll go to me father and say to him, "Father, I've seen the game there, and the game there." When he was yet a great way off, his father saw him, and that pity, and ran to meet him, and fell on his neck and kissed him. For this my son was dead, and he's alive again. He was lost and is found.
John Townend's recording is the Bible story of the prodigal son, the boy who came home. But if you look among the headstones here in this enormous military cemetery, none of these were among the lucky ones. Just as the war began for most of these men on board a train will be the scene of the final act of this war. On November the 11th, 1918, Germany's unconditional surrender was signed in a railway carriage in a forest in France. When the armistice did come in November 1918, the trains took the remnants of the armies home. But the railways were one of the main reasons why so many had died. They just kept bringing more and more and more men in to replace those at the front who'd been killed. In all, 16 million were slaughtered. And for what? It wasn't, as they claimed, the war to end all wars, because in just 21 years, the world was plunged into darkness and chaos again with the Second World War. In the end, it had been just a pointless and tragic waste of so many young lives.